in our day, he says, where things are decided by one man, what need is there for that kind of greatness in oratory? The scope of things which you work on is far reduced, and oratory itself is reduced in its scope and in its greatness and in its aspiration. We, however, he says, enjoyed the benefits of peace. Then they did not have peace but civil discord, but they had great oratory. Let each age, he says, enjoy the benefits of its time and not long for what is not possible in its time. Which sounds as if he's very altogether come to terms with this, except that we know in writing about Cato, he hasn't. Right? He's reminding people of what is lost under the empire. And in fact, one of his remarks to one of the characters, he says, "Speak to us with that ancient freedom from which we have fallen farther even than from ancient excellence in oratory." Right? So he's aware of the questionable freedom available in Rome, but again indicates a need to come to terms with it in a certain way. And so what is that way? You see, well, I mean, here Maternus is someone who moves from politics and oratory to poetry, dramaturgy, but historical dramaturgy, right? Cato. I think it's what it is, it's an analysis of the issue which prefigures Tacitus's own decision later. Tacitus will move from the consul, orator, etc., to becoming not indeed a poet, but a writer of history. Not of historical plays, but of history proper. Why? Well, how should one live under this kind of regime? You know? What is the highest aspiration one can have under such a regime? You know, for someone like Tacitus, he's been consul, but being consul under the empire is not a peak of statesmanship. His aspiration as a human being goes where Agricola's was forbidden to go. Right? It goes to intellectual life, ultimately, as his greatest fulfillment. Intellectual life through the writing of history, not poetry. What does that have to do with philosophy? Well, I would say quite simply that for the ancients, the distinction between history and philosophy is not rigorously made. History is something which you could say political philosophy requires history for all of its examples to reflect on, to understand regime types and causes and consequences. And history itself is informed, the greatest historians, certainly Tacitus, certainly Polybius, are informed by a desire to come to the deepest understanding of political life, its sources, its causes, its ends or purposes, the range of alternatives. There's not a kind of clear distinction. I think here I follow Hobbes. Hobbes, in one place, enumerates Tacitus, along with Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and so on, as the classic tradition of political philosophy. So these orient us towards looking at the histories of Tacitus. And for want of time, let me just give one example of reading Tacitus. And this comes from very early, I'll take something from the histories, which are less widely read, less well known perhaps than the annals. The histories begin with the death of Nero, the year of the 3 or 4 emperors. Right? Nero died, and Galba had been proclaimed emperor by his troops in Spain, and proceeds to Rome and makes good his claim to power. Briefly, a few months, until he's overthrown by Otto, who makes good his power quite briefly until he's overthrown by Vitellius, who lasts a few months until he's eventually conquered by the troops of Vespasian coming from the east. And Vespasian establishes what comes to be called the Flavian dynasty in 70, 71 actually, and he reigns for a fair number of years, I think about 10. His son Titus, good emperor for 2, and then Domitian, right, who is emperor when Agricola is conquering Britain, is the next emperor, who begins rather well. Titus and Domitian are the 2 sons of Vespasian. Domitian begins fairly well, but then becomes really just terrible. Slaughter of many senators, accusations, paranoia, and so on. I mean, dreadful, dreadful times, dreadful years, according to Tacitus. At the end of the 4th paragraph of Book 1, speaking of Galba having been made emperor, Tacitus writes a famous phrase, the secret of empire, a famous phrase, arcanum imperii. You often see that in the plural, arcana imperii, the secrets of rule or of empire. Here in the singular, the secret of empire was made commonly known, Tacitus writes, per vulgato, promulgated out among the people. The secret of empire was promulgated out among the people, namely, an emperor, princeps, could be made elsewhere than at Rome. Elsewhere than at Rome. Think about that. See, I'm using this to illustrate my theme then about the histories, which is that their fundamental purpose is to enable us to understand imperial governance, how it works, what it's about, with a view to how you can best live under it and so on. And here, interesting, right? A secret of the empire is made commonly known. And that secret, an emperor can be made elsewhere than at Rome. What does that mean? Well, of course, up to now, emperors are always made at Rome. They're proclaimed emperor by the Senate, and they are emperors. But if they can be made elsewhere at Rome, why elsewhere? Well, that's where the troops are. You have some troops, the Praetorians, etc., in Rome, but most of the troops are on the periphery. They're on the borders, where they're needed for military purposes. And emperors can be made there by the troops. This is a secret which is now revealed. Now revealed to the people, to everyone. It's a secret which, I think it's fair to say, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, you don't know, he's such a sugar but certainly Claudius, and Nero in his youth, in his early, they were aware of this, but it wasn't public knowledge, right? It wasn't public knowledge because Augustus followed the policy which Machiavelli recommends, perhaps drawing on Augustus's example, that if you want to change a regime and make the change more easily acceptable, keep many of the old forms. And people will be, as Hobbes talked about, right, the same names of the magistrates. And Hobbes comments, people are often deceived just by the mere appearances. Another Machiavellian theme. Right? Keep the forms, and you may be able to bring about very fundamental change and make it more easily accepted. That's what Augustus did. That was continued by these people. Nero, already, you see he indicates that Nero is first, in fact, chosen to be emperor by his being presented to the Praetorian guards, and they say, this is great. Then the Senate gives it to him, and the Senate presents it as if they had made the choice. But of course they hadn't. They were ratifying the choice made by the Praetorian guards. So but if you're just looking at it from the outside without particular thought, you might not know that. You might not know that. So the secret is still, in some sense, secret, at least from some people. But once Galba is proclaimed emperor in Spain by his troops, and it makes it good, hey, there's no secret anymore, right? So what then emerges? What emerges then is that it becomes plain that the basis of power of the Roman Empire is, of course, the military. Any functioning government has to have the strongest force, which normally is the military, on its side. But the question is, what is the status of the relationships between the military and the rest of the government. We are accustomed to the notion of